friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I just am here for a quick tip of a useful item that I have been, in the past year or so, I've been using and adding more of these because I keep finding more uses for them. And I thought some of you might appreciate this. So what I'm talking about are the foldable dog pen. It's usually in 8 panels, and so you can make it into an octagonal shape. You can use it straight and stretch it across to anything. You can make it a rectangle shape, a square, however you want to use it, depending on how you're using it. So obviously the use is purported for is for a dog pen, but I don't exactly use it as that. In fact, the very first one I bought so that I could, when Jackson, my oldest grandson, started getting to the age where he was rolling around and moving around more and then starting to crawl, and that was during the winter, and we had a fire always going in the wood stove, and so I was trying to keep him away from that area and some of the various other things that are right next to the wood stove, because it's also where my desk, my pens, pencils, scissors, all kinds of things like that. And so I initially bought one because it was the cheapest way to go than getting a playpen for him, and that way he could still roam all around the living room. He just couldn't get to the wood stove, and so I put that in front of there. It worked like a charm, even when he got to be where he was old enough to pull himself up. Now eventually he got old enough where he knows better than to touch the wood stove, and so I don't have to worry about that anymore. But what I found shortly after getting that it also made a really great fence to go across. So this was the second use, to go across the deck right where the steps are, so that I could keep our little dog Cody up on the deck instead of going into the walkway. Now a lot of times it's not a big deal for him to go into the walkway, but when people are coming and going, and sometimes Pat's coming and going in and out of the gate that goes through the walkway, and I just want to keep him more contained and not have him run around, I can put that fence there. And the same thing goes when Luna, his sister, is here. But also for the days like when the meter reader comes, because our power meter is right by our back door, our UPS guy comes up to our back door, a lot of people come up to our back door, and so this is a way that even though he doesn't bite anyone, he does like to bark, and he can. People who are afraid of dogs get a little terrified of him. People who are not afraid of dogs know better, like the UPS guy. He knows. He always brings cookies, and that's why Cody barks at him now, is because it's like, where's my cookies? But it is a way to sort of, like our meter reader who comes and reads our power meter is a little scared of dogs, and so she gets very nervous when he's out there. So that just keeps her feeling a little more secure, and I don't have to worry about making sure he's locked into the house, because I don't always know exactly what day she's going to show up. And of course, once Jackson started walking, that keeps him up on the deck as well. And I also then bought one for the front deck and was using it out there so I could let him play on the front deck, and then would simply stretch it across the area that went down the steps, so he couldn't just go run out in the yard and out in the street. Obviously, I was still keeping an eye on him, but that way if I had my back turned or I had to go do something else and I couldn't see him for a minute or two, I know he's going to stay up on the deck. And so that worked like a charm. Then I started finding great ways to use it in the garden area. So right behind me here, you probably won't be able to see it, but I bought, most of the ones I have are only 2 feet tall. The one that's back here is 3 feet tall. And what that does is I have it going all the way around the deck, except for obviously up the steps here. So I have one on each side of the taller one. And that keeps the chickens from going under the deck, as well as keeping them from being able to come up onto the deck, because we're really trying to keep them off the deck. And that's also why, you probably can't see it here, but Patrick made this saloon style gate where we can walk in and out of it and don't have to use our hands. We can just push our body through it if our hands are full, but it keeps the chickens from coming up on the deck and pooping on everything and getting into my potted plants up here. So then the next thing I started doing was in the greenhouse. What I like to do is in the late summer, once the plants in the greenhouse are big enough that the chickens aren't going to hurt them, like the tomato plants and stuff, or I'm just done with them entirely, I like to let the chickens roam around in there and use that greenhouse as a dry place where they can hang out. And they till up the dirt and they poop in there, and so it fertilizes the soil for the next year. So all through the winter and then early spring at least, and clear up until the point where I'm ready to start putting my tomatoes in the ground. Well, what I did before was I used some kind of nylon fencing so that I could put my tomatoes in the ground and still let the chickens hang out in there for a little while longer. But I have a chicken that's like Houdini, and she always managed to get through there and tear up my plants. So, like, she'd find ways under it, around it, whatever. So I decided, how about I try these little metal fences? They only need, in enclosed areas like that, they only need to be 2 feet tall to keep the chickens out, at least my chickens. Even though I know they could get over it, but usually when you're talking about smaller enclosed areas, they won't do it. So this year, instead of using nylon fencing, I decided to use that same fencing in there, and it worked great. So it gave the chickens more time to hang out in there until I went to put the rest of my plants in the ground, because it wouldn't fit around the middle section. I couldn't get one to, I would have had to use a couple to go around there, and it wasn't that big a deal, because then by the time I'm doing that, the chickens will have plenty of other dry areas they can find, even on rainy days in the summer. Well, then I have this area in front of the greenhouse that I was using these little things like this and just putting them in there to keep the chickens from getting in there and digging up the plants that I have just outside there. But I use these for a lot of things, actually. Originally were hanging pots. But then I found that even though I love having things growing in hanging pots, all the things I want to grow in them don't do great in hanging pots for a whole. They usually don't make it through the winter. So I started using those for many other things. And I can talk about that in another video. But, well, one of the things is when I'm planting my potatoes out front and I still want to let the chickens roam around there, I put one of those baskets over the top of where I planted the potato and put a stake in there to make sure it doesn't get shifted around by the chickens' feet. Then they can still roam around in there for a while without digging up my potatoes. So I've used them for that and many other things. I put them over other things too, like that, herbs and stuff that I want to allow to, where I'm not ready to block the chickens off of certain areas, and then I'll put those over those just to protect them so they can start growing until I totally block them off for the area. So now there are two garden areas like this, like the center section back here in the middle of our backyard, and then the front yard section that we have poultry fencing around, the kind that you can move, and it's just a nylon fencing, and that is really handy and useful in a lot of ways. But the little dog pens I find useful in other ways. So where maybe I don't want fencing that tall, or just like the little 2-foot fencing, so using it in the greenhouse. Well, then coming back to this area in front of the greenhouse that I'm going to expand it now. One of those fences is just long enough where I can have the end of it go in front of the greenhouse door, so I can have the door open, so on hot days so the air can get through can flow through there. But I can just open and close that little end of the fencing to go in and out of the greenhouse. But it also will totally enclose that front section, so I could take those little baskets out, and now I'm going to expand that front section so that the horehound and the chocolate mint can come out farther, because I only need a narrow walkway between the greenhouse area and then the center garden area just to get through there. That's all we need. And so the chickens and the dog can get through there too. And so that keeps the chickens out of that area. It gives me a little gate. So then I've got the two other covered, well, one's covered, the other one's going to be covered, archways that are at the back section that I always close off. And usually I'll put some kind of, like a couple sheets of polycarbonate sheet or something in front because we don't have it all closed in yet and no doors, to keep the chickens out during the time that I've got planted. Again, just like most of my other garden areas, the chickens are allowed to hang out in there during the time of the year nothing is growing, because I think that's very beneficial to the soil and to the chickens, and they can get all the bugs and leave their fertilizer and then dig everything up. But obviously, once I've planted my beans, my squash, my potatoes, my whatever else is going in those areas, I don't want the chickens in there. So the problem with the polycarbonate is it doesn't stay solid. Even with put in place stakes, it tends to flop around. The wind blows it around, and it's much harder for me to step over. And so I found using those those same dog crates and putting them in front of those covered areas keeps the chickens out. It actually allows more airflow in there too, and it's much easier for me to step over. I could set those up in such a way where I could use it as a gate, but because of the length of it didn't really work out that way, so I had to fold them in half. And then another thing I did is I have another garden section over next to the fence on this side that we're starting to work on, and I decided to experiment with it right away. So I just made a little narrow piece and where I planted some more snow peas right up next to the chicken yard, because there's already fencing there for it to climb. So I'm giving that a try. Well, obviously I don't want the chickens digging up the snow peas, so I put one there as well. Eventually that whole area is going to be expanded out. Patrick's already tilled it once. We're letting the chickens just keep working it up. We'll be tilling it again, adding some grass clippings and whatever else in there, some wood shavings from Patrick's shop. And then next spring, I'm going to totally close that in using that same fencing, because I know it works. The chickens won't go over it. They can't go through it. And so it's been very, very handy, and it doesn't look bad. It actually certainly looks a lot nicer than polycarbonate sheets or even fiberglass sheets in front of it. And it stays put because these pens come with stakes, with U-shaped stakes that you put down into the ground just around the base of it like that. And so it's perfect. I love it. And I'll probably still be getting a little bit more. Now in the long run, a whole bunch of these can be quite expensive, but if you're just getting, starting with one and then kind of adding to a little bit at a time as you find more places to use them and ways that you can use them, I find I'm just really in love with these things. And the comparison to like getting a long piece of poultry fencing that's maybe $200 for I think 100 feet, that's a lot less expensive. But because these are shorter, smaller pieces, and I can find more ways to use them, and I can set them up anywhere. I can set them up on a deck, I can set them up inside, I can set them up out in the yard. They're more useful to me, especially for smaller areas, than the poultry fencing would be. And I can step over them easily enough because they're only 2 feet tall, yet they still keep the chickens and the dog out of any areas I don't want them in. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there, what I've been using them for, something to consider. And I'll put a link to the ones I have. The ones that I have come in, I think, 3 or 4 different heights. I'm pretty sure it's at least 3 different heights. I think you can get up to 4 feet tall. So they got 2 feet, they got 3 feet. Those are the ones I have. And then I think they have a 4 foot tall, or maybe 3.5, something like that. So I'll put a link to that. You can check it out and do some price comparisons and see if you can find a better deal if it's something you're interested in doing. But yeah, just a metal fence. It's going to last for a long time. It can't be cut and torn or bitten in half like some of your nylon fencing can. And it's going to last the weather better than a lot of that nylon type fencing is. You want to let your chickens roam free, or even your little dogs, and you don't want them in your flower beds or other smaller garden areas, it's just a really great option to look into. And again, it's foldable. You can fold it right up. You can shape it any way you want. Now, if you can think of any other ideas that you might find useful for these, go ahead and put them down below so other people can read that and consider it for themselves. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.